everyone. Welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today is Monday, July the 3rd, 2023. I'm Simon Rafe, here with my two co-hosts, Carl Copey and Christine Niles. And joining us today in the fourth chair is Dave Gordon. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Simon, from the unimportant chair.
Today, you are particularly important, Dave, because we're talking about a bunch of key rulings that have come down from the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'm very glad to have both you and Christine, who are lawyers, on the court with Kyle and I, who are just here to look good in a suit. Anyway, there have been several key rulings come down recently from the U.S. Supreme Court. Many of these rulings were seen as a cause for conservatives to celebrate. But is anything in these rulings of particular interest for Catholics? Well, to answer that question, perhaps we can start by looking at Thursday's ruling in the case of Groff versus DeJoy. The case centered on Gerard Groff, a former U.S. Postal Service worker in Pennsylvania. Groff is an evangelical Protestant, and he asked the court to decide whether the Postal Service could require him to deliver Amazon packages on a Sunday, a violation of his religious practices and beliefs. The court has ruled in Groff's favor. And in another decision, the court said a Christian web developer who designs websites, like all web developers, including those cute little save-the-date sites for weddings, will not have to make websites for gay couples getting married. That is two decisions which many Christians see as key victories for religious freedom. All right, so which one of the lawyers wants to go first and explain a case?
1, 2, 3, not it. Okay.
You mentioned Groff.
So, Groff versus DeJoy, since, we'll go chronologically. You mentioned that one first. I think what's important is actually that the court granted cert in this case to begin with. Certiorari agreed to take the case. And that's a lot of, it's telling. It tells you the mind of the court. It tells you what the priorities.
Supreme Court, sorry to interrupt you, Dave, but I'm probably going to do this quite a lot. There's a lot of terms of art that you two are going to be throwing around that I'm certain that I'm not overly familiar with, and the audience probably won't be either. But you're talking about that they agreed to hear the case. The Supreme Court doesn't have to hear every case at all. And the choice to hear a case is actually quite significant.
Extremely. Just to give perspective, they only take about 1% of all cases that request petition for certiorari.
Right, exactly. It's a kind of a court of voluntary jurisdiction in a lot of matters. So you have a right to an appeal, but those will be taken by the federal circuit courts of appeal. And that's where, the buck stops for just the vast majority of legal cases. So the fact, oftentimes what the court chooses to focus on in a given term, in a given few years, is telling as to what the justices are seeing as the important issues in the culture. So the fact that we have seen a few cases that are focusing on religious liberty, I think is telling to the minds of the justices that they're seeing religious liberty as coming under greater and greater attack. And in an age of kind of positive rights, the government's telling you, you have a right to something. You have a right to your homosexual marriage. You have a right to your homosexual expression. Those positive rights always interfere with negative rights, which is the government says and these are the true rights. These are the ones that are actually constitutionally protected. The government says you have a right to be protected from interference in the practice of your speech, your faith, etc. So it's protections from something, intrusion into, freedom of association, freedom of the press. These things are held sacrosanct. And as we've had positive rights, which are false rights, expand, those necessarily expand into the realm of negative rights. And the court has, I think, seen that. It's felt the wind, felt the prevailing wind, taken the temperature of the room, and decided, okay, we're going to kind of carve out explicitly, where the rubber meets the road. Mm-hmm. We're going to say, we're going to now protect religious rights as those are coming under greater and greater attack from the left. So in this case, essentially, it's mildly important. I wouldn't adjudge it overly important. It's applying and interpreting the law of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which essentially says that you cannot have government discrimination or private discrimination on against somebody for, among other things, like race and religion, national origin, etc., a few more protected classes. So the 64 Civil Rights Act says essentially that employers must make certain accommodations to people of faith in their employment if it's just a matter of law. It's you have a right to certain accommodations as an employee. And what had happened before is that the court had interpreted those accommodations that employers have to make to employees when, say, employment arrangements would infringe upon religious practice. They made the bar very, very high for employees to be able to claim that, you know, this is infringing upon my practice of my religious rights. And they said if essentially the employee's practice of his religious rights would create more than a de minimis cost for the employer does not have to honor the employee's religious practices. In this case that we see being adjudicated recently, Groff, it's whether he could have Sunday, the day of rest, off from mandatory deliveries of Amazon packages.
Yeah, because I don't get, like, my regular USPS mail doesn't come to me on a Sunday, but, you know, Amazon packages occasionally turn up, and I think in certain situations what Amazon has actually done is they've contracted with the USPS to have workers deliver it via the USPS system on a Sunday.
Sure.
So I can get my Amazon package on a Sunday, but I can't get my actual, like, regular mail.
Right, and I think the Supreme Court, too, kind of went through all the objections of Amazon, saying, well, we need to work on a Sunday because of such and such. It's causing this impact on his coworkers and all this various other things. And the Supreme Court essentially said, well, that's not enough. That's not enough. You have to show a lot more than that to essentially infringe on his religious right to practice his religion, essentially.
Yeah,
Right.
it seemed to me like the Postal Service was trying to make the argument that, oh, well, there's not enough people in his town to take his place on a Sunday. And the court said, no, well, there's a ton of workers in the county. We're not just looking at the town. And also, I think the Postal Service tried to argue that...
Amazon.
Oh, I'm sorry, Amazon. Amazon tried to argue that the overtime pay would be burdensome, and the court said, no, it wouldn't. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, it was interesting about what Simon was saying is, like, we shifted, so now this actually affects postal workers, that they're having to deliver Amazon packages on a Sunday. One's reminded of the Seinfeld where Jerry takes over Newman's route and he's like, but it's Sunday, we don't deliver mail on Sunday, and Jerry's just like, oops. So that just started happening, but that had actual, you know, downstream ramifications where now we're having USPS workers work on Sundays, and that affects people who see Sunday as a day of rest, Christians. So the question is whether this is an undue hardship on the employer, the U.S. Postal Service, to accommodate the Christian day of rest for this Christian worker. And the Supreme Court had previously said if it's more than a de minimis hardship for the employer, then you don't have to accommodate it. Now they're changing tack on that. What they've said is that if there's a substantial, it has to be a substantial burden, and that's going to be determined based on the fact pattern of the case at hand. So that they're not going to be able to say, you know, what exactly a substantial burden is in every case. That's up for the court that is the finder of fact, not the court of review of law, which is, you know, the appellate courts review law, generally not fact unless there's a gross error in the original trial court. So they're saying that there has to be, in order for employers to not accommodate employees' religious practices, essentially there has to be a substantial burden on the employer. That's what came out of this.
Yeah, so
It's a greater protection of religious freedom.
Yeah. Just so obviously you used the phrase de minimis, which obviously, like, from Latin is kind of meaning a very small or a minimal idea there. So obviously that's kind of what they're saying. They're saying that this thing can't just be, it's like, oh, I'm slightly put out. You've got to actually show some sort of substantial thing, similar to, like, when they talk about, you know, the compelling government interest in infringing upon these rights. They often discuss that there. I think it's very interesting as well that you've got this chap, Groff, who clearly at some point took a job working for the Postal Service. I don't know how long he's been, well, he says he's an
2012, I believe.
2012. Okay, so he's been doing this for like at least 10 years. He says he's a former U.S. Postal Service worker. I don't know if he quit because he had to work on Sunday or something, but clearly been doing it for a while. Took this job there probably long before Amazon started tapping U.S. postal workers to deliver on Sunday. That, to my mind, it seems to be not related to the legal question here, but it just like, so Jeff Bezos or whoever goes to the Postmaster General and over, a beer somewhere, they agree, hey, we'll use your workers, and presumably Amazon is paying for that and what have you, but at what point are these workers kind of being forced to work on a Sunday when clearly, you take a job with the U.S. Postal Service, it's like, dude, I get every Sunday off. That's just a known thing because we don't deliver mail on a Sunday. That's just how it works. And suddenly the ground has shifted underneath him, at which point this becomes not just an issue of a victory for religious freedom and expression and all of that sort of stuff, but it also becomes an issue of, hey, we're actually giving something here, a bit of strength and a bit of kindness to workers. It's like, yeah, your boss can't just unilaterally change your situation here because Amazon, the great elephant in the room, wants to change the delivery date.
Well, sometimes, and the court actually notes this, there's kind of off-the-record court discussions. I don't know if that would have, that wasn't a legal theory that was brought up in the case. I mean, sometimes one wonders if these things play into justice's concerns, but that wasn't anything that was part and parcel of their decision. But, one other thing that is important to come out of this is actually, and they referenced this in the case, the majority opinion, it was a 9-0 decision, but the opinion in this case, a unanimous decision, as I said, it talks about the rules of statutory interpretation. And that's really important because in the 70s, 80s, we had kind of a runaway Supreme Court. It was the time when the Democrats and their appointees, their nominees, were hard left, but the Republicans were just like not hard right at all. They weren't right at all. They were just kind of squishy and didn't stand for much in terms of judicial philosophy. This opinion demonstrates a commitment to interpreting the black letter law in accord with the text, as opposed to reading into it intentionalism and all these silly leftist theories of jurisprudence that came into vogue and kind of went unchallenged. And I'm thinking of the Nixon appointees to the Supreme Court, and just where we had the Supreme Court doing a lot of mischief through legislating from the bench, and they reaffirm a commitment here to statutory interpretation, actually interpreting what the statute says, not what they want it to say.
And that's consistent with the judicial philosophy of the conservative majority in the court. If you look at each of the ones who are typically ruling in favor of what I would say are very, very good decisions. Speaking of runaway court in the 1970s, the Supreme Court caused the left to have a meltdown on the last day of Pride Month by overturning or essentially asserting the rights of a Christian graphic web designer not to have to violate her conscience, her religious beliefs, by doing business, promoting this websites for same-sex couples. And now, last week, I would say the Supreme Court handed down a triple whammy that had all the liberals melting down. You had the banning of the striking down the Biden's loan forgiveness program as unconstitutional, and then you had the affirmative action ruling, which we'll get into. But this, by far, is the one that got them the most upset, because now you've got headlines everywhere inaccurately blaring the claim that, now we can just discriminate against LGBT. Now it's anti-gay stuff. That's okay now. No, that's not what this is about. This is not at all what it's about. So essentially, this is about, it was called 303 Creative v. Alanis, and it essentially answered the question that the Jack Phillips Masterpiece Cake Shop Supreme Court ruling did not answer. So this is about Lori Smith, devout Christian, like I said. She owns a website graphic design business in Littleton, Colorado, and she wanted to start including wedding websites. But as a devout Christian, she is opposed to so-called same-sex marriage. And she said, I can't, but the problem is in Colorado has a statute, has a law that requires that you not discriminate against LGBT. And she only wanted to service heterosexual couples. And she understood, if I follow through with my religious convictions, I run afoul of this law. And so she essentially sued Colorado, because she said this violates my religious beliefs. This went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in her favor. The U.S. Supreme Court first, what we have to understand is free speech not only protects your right to speak, it also protects your right not to speak. It protects your right not to be compelled by the government to speak words that are against your religious beliefs or your convictions. And in this case, it would have been the latter that would have happened to her. Also, free speech covers a lot more than simply what you speak or what you write. It also covers expression, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it could be a painting, it could be even dance, it could be a protest out in the street. And in this case, they determined that creating a website using graphic design and art and all of that is included as speech. And so they said this is a clear violation. This is what Gorsuch actually said, that she had to choose between following her conscience, which means only creating wedding websites for opposite-sex couples, that's violating Colorado law, or following the law and violating her religious beliefs. And Gorsuch said, quote, that is enough, more than enough, to represent an impermissible abridgment of the First Amendment's right to speak freely. And then he provided other examples as well, because he said if this law was allowed to continue in effect, and in fact, lots of states have similar laws. He said this is actually very dangerous because, for instance, the government could actually force an unwilling Muslim movie director to make a film with a Zionist message, which entirely contradicts his personal convictions. They could compel an atheist muralist to accept a commission celebrating evangelical zeal. They could require a gay website designer to create websites for a group advocating against same-sex marriage. So he's applying this all, he's saying, for them, it was very clear. But of course, we have the three leftist liberal women, including lapsed Catholic, Justice Sonia Sotomayor writing the dissent, calling it a very sad day for the LGBT movement. And she actually argued that the website business was not speech. She said this is just a business. And once you open up a business, according to the law, you have to service everybody. You can't deny one group of people a business while servicing another group. But that's her claim.
A couple things there. I would just add, this is highlighting exactly what I said previously about when you create so-called positive rights versus negative rights. And of course, there's a subtext here, because positive rights, the whole idea is that this right is being given to you by government, whereas with negative rights, the right to not be compelled to speak against your conscience, this is something that's given to you by God. And you can even read this in some of the church's documents, Vatican II documents on freedom of conscience and whatnot. So there's a subtext here, and it's important for people to note that.
Yeah, and she also says, businesses don't have a right to discriminate against a protected class. Well, that's kind of a problem for us Catholics, right, for Christians, because we don't think that same-sex couples should be a protected class. I mean, sure, they shouldn't be discriminated against in the sense of people calling them horrible names and things like that, and being treated horribly. But like for instance, in the Jack Phillips case, they tried to make it seem as if they painted it as if he absolutely refused to serve any homosexuals at all, period. And that's not true. He made all sorts of cakes for homosexuals. What he wasn't going to do was he's going to make a cake where he was celebrating a same-sex marriage, because that was forcing him.
That's speech.
Exactly.
Right?
Speech, yeah. It's interesting because that false interpretation of the law and various instances was actually referenced by Barack Obama. I think it was at one of the press club dinners or something, and he was joking about how close he and Joe Biden were, working very closely together and so forth. And he said, we're so closely that that when we go to Indiana, we can't get pizza. Because what had happened was a pizza parlor in Indiana had been asked to provide the wedding breakfast. Who has pizza for a wedding? Gay people. That's who have pizza for a wedding.
Wedding breakfast?
Wedding. That's what they're called. It's a wedding breakfast. Yeah. It is because you don't because you fast from midnight to the mass and then you break the fast with the thing after. You should become Catholic. It's great.
One day.
So they'd said, we don't want to provide the pizza for this gay wedding, and of course that's what Barack Obama was referencing. But the thing was, it's like you could go and you could be as gay as you like and get pizza at that pizza parlor, wouldn't be a problem. They just didn't want to do it that way. Same way with Jack Phillips, he would make you any cake if you were, whatever you were, gay, straight, whatever. But he didn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding because that would have been speech.
There's something that also needs to be pointed out here, and Christine, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but you'll remember, like, going back to property law, you learn that one of the fundamental aspects of property is the right to exclude, right? Going back to like our 1L year. And this mischief starts with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which had good intentions. But when you start telling private business owners, people who own property, that they are places of public accommodation and they cannot exclude, even if the reasons for excluding are invidious discrimination, which would be sinful. It's wrong to say, like, I'm not going to service black people in my restaurant, but that's still their right to do. And the government sort of stepped in and redefined property, and now they're having to walk that back. Like, decisions have consequences, and sin begets sin. So when you start tinkering with the right to exclude, which is part and parcel of what it means to have property, when you create problems like this downstream.
And it started really with the sexes, right? There are a few Supreme Court cases that came up to them, and they decided that women should be allowed into male-only clubs, which I, as a woman, I disagree with that. I think there should be, in some cases, male-only clubs where only men get to go. But the Supreme Court has decided in certain instances that women must be allowed in. And if you notice something, do you ever notice that it's always the women who want to be admitted? That it's never the other way around. The man is never suing to go into a women's group, unless, of course, he's transgender. Then that's different. If it's transgender sports, then that's different.
It's interesting. So you've actually brought this thing up, and the notion of property rights. But I think you can actually kind of expand that out, as the left has recently tried to do. This isn't connected with these recent cases, but I think it's a similar sort of philosophical position. You and I, Christine, have discussed the LGB without the T and the get the L out movements within the homosexual and transgender communities. But repeatedly, there has been this individuals who have said, well, a biological male identifies as a lesbian woman and wishes to insist that biological female lesbians date him, interact with him, have sex with him, whatever. And the biological female lesbians are kind of like, no, we do not want to do that. And it's much the same sort of issue there. It's that same philosophy of coming in and redefining these positions, these rights, and what things are. And the right to exclude, the right to say, well, you know what, I don't want to date somebody who is a biological male. I only want to date biological women. And now that apparently is hate speech. I'm going to get banned. I'm going to get banned on YouTube for that. But we've now actually seen that this has moved beyond property rights. It's now moved to this notion of like your right over your own self. Your right to interact with people. I mean, all of the rights of within the First Amendment to the Constitution appear to be under attack. The right of obviously religious rights, freedom of speech, right of assembly. That's two people wish to assemble together into a dating couple or something. They all appear to be under attack. So it is good to see that the Supreme Court is coming back.
I mean, and that was one of the great things about Dobbs v. Jackson overturning Roe v. Wade, because this wasn't just about abortion. This was about a much wider issue, which was essentially the abuse of the so-called right to privacy. And Justice Alito, in his opinion, essentially walked back the right to privacy because, as many of you know, right to privacy really started being used in Griswold v. Connecticut to read a right to contraception for married couples in the Constitution. Then that right was expanded in Eisenstadt v. Baird in 1972 to expand that right to any couple who wants to use contraception because it's the right to privacy and, it's a private thing. And then they expanded it even more. They used that as the basis for Roe v. Wade, expanding it even more. If it's right to contraception, now it's right to abortion. Then Fast forward 2015, they used the same right to privacy to protect so-called gay marriage, and it just keeps mushrooming and mushrooming and mushrooming.
Well,
and the great thing
it's making a copy of a copy of a copy.
Yeah.
When you get one, that's the problem with stare decisis as a system. This idea that precedent binds the court going forward is that when you get one thing wrong, and we've gotten many things wrong, going back to the beginning of the Republic, and even the necessary and proper clause, and then in the 20th century, early 20th century, Commerce Clause jurisprudence saying that the federal government can regulate absolutely everything, it creates, by the time you're on the 100th copy or the 100th iteration of using this bad precedent to make further decisions, then you have something that no longer even vaguely resembles the Constitution. That's where we're at now, and that's why we need a paradigm shift on the court. Even Roberts, with his sanctimonious air of faux theological admiration for the institution of the United States Supreme Court, with all of its errors and blunders through the year, it needs to go. There have been so many travesties of justice. If we're talking Korematsu, we go back to Dred Scott, all of these things that were ushered in by the Supreme Court, they just need to go, and we need to stop being like, well, I'm going to try and make this like it's consonant with our previous case law. Just call it out. We've gotten a bunch of stuff wrong, and we need to pivot away from this ridiculous adherence to past decisions.
And this, again, comes down to your judicial philosophy, because, look, I both went to law school, and I understand why courts follow precedent. It's because we want stability, we want predictability. That's why, we don't want things changing from one moment to the next. But I agree with you that if it's bad precedent, if it's bad law, overturn it. Don't simply say, well, it's precedent. And that's how Roe v. Wade was allowed to hang on for so long, because, well, it's been on the books for 40, 50 years now, and, it would just be, it would cause all sorts of civil disruption if we were to overturn it. Now, Justice Thomas, I have a great deal of respect for Justice Clarence Thomas, because he's been the only one consistently on there saying, this is bad law. It has been bad law from the beginning. I would overturn it immediately. It doesn't matter. That's been on the books for 100 years. It's bad law. He consistently says that. And I'm grateful for the courage, too, of Justice Alito and the others to finally overturn Roe v. Wade and admit this is really bad law. But moving on to something else that was bad law that's been on the books for almost as long as Roe v. Wade is the affirmative action cases. Now, this also caused the liberals to have a huge meltdown. Just to give perspective, Roe v. Wade was handed down in 1973, enshrining the right to abortion in the Constitution. Affirmative action was enshrined in the Constitution in 1978. So it's been around for 45 years, race-based admissions in colleges. And this case regarding Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard involved both Harvard and University of North Carolina. And Harvard was apparently discriminating against Asian Americans. Statistically, Asian Americans were getting the highest grades, and yet they were not being enrolled at all. I mean, the enrollment, even though they were getting superior scores across the board, the enrollment was not matching with the applications. And instead, it was proven that the Hispanics and the African Americans were getting favorable treatment over the Asians. So a group of them sued Harvard, I think also University of North Carolina, claiming this is, discrimination. Now, the problem is, back in 1978, you had the case of California v. Bakey, where the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said it's okay. It's okay to take race as a factor in college admissions, but it was narrow. Okay, it was a narrow thing. It was like it can be one factor, and it is a compelling government interest to desire diversity on the student body, as if race is the only factor of diversity, But anyway, ever since that time, they've used race-based admissions in just about everything. And with the Harvard admissions process, they kind of went through it. And race plays a critical factor. It wasn't like one of the little extra pluses. It was critical because applications go through several processes, and it goes through different readers who kind of like give their opinion on who should be applied. And then at the very final stage, where you have the board of admissions looking at each application, they look at 4 different criteria. One of them is race. So it is absolutely crucial to allowing someone in or not. And like I said, the Asian Americans were clearly being discriminated against. Harvard was saying, this is how Harvard, this is how they described the lawsuit, because they actually have a web page devoted to this lawsuit, trying to call it bogus. They're going to have to take it down now in light of this Supreme Court opinion.
Incident never forgets.
But they said, this is Harvard's description. an organization created by anti-race conscious admissions activist Edward Blum sued Harvard. So look at that, anti-race conscious admissions activist. Anyway, the point. The point is, the good news is, finally, after 45 years on the books, this whole affirmative action then has been struck down as unconstitutional, a very clear violation of equal protection of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I look at that there, and obviously, if I was running university, that would be a terrible idea. But if I was running a university and I had any kind of decision-making process on it, I would want to look and say, okay, well, the role of the university, the role of the academy is to educate people. It is to educate people in a more advanced body of knowledge than they have hitherto had access to. That is the purpose of this. So obviously you have very kind of specialized vocational intellectual degrees such as law, medicine, and that sort of stuff. You have engineering degrees, you have math, you have science. You can then go into the more, sort of squishy degrees. It's fine. It's fine. I was an English undergrad, I can say. That you go and English literature, okay, fine.
The soft science.
The soft sciences, English literature. I wouldn't even put like sociology and psychology in the soft sciences. They're getting relatively hard. I'd sit there and say, sitting around having a cup of coffee at like 9 o'clock at night discussing Moliere, that is not a hard science. So, people, let's be honest right now. But you're imparting people with this knowledge, and the first criteria should be, how good are you at the subject? How much knowledge can you be given? How far can you be taken along this thing? Because the goal is to create people who are very intelligent. Now, obviously, there is the somewhat racist stereotype, of course, that Asians are all very good at math and so forth. But certainly, Asian Americans do very well, disproportionately well, arguably, in academic disciplines. I mean, that's obviously the case. So that there should be, in theory, a greater number of Asians represented in the university population than in the population at large, which, of course, is not happening. There's this situation where and to my mind, that makes absolutely no sense. And what do you do when you know you're the affirmative action admission? I believe Clarence Thomas has actually spoken about this, that he went and he had this constant fear while at university that he, as a black man, was an affirmative action admission, and therefore he was being looked down on by those people around him. It's like, well, I'm being looked down on by those people around me. Do they think that I'm dumb? Do they think I'm the poor, dumb hick who's just been let in because of the color of my skin? I mean, what does that do to a man? Obviously, Clarence Thomas, very intelligent man, certainly has risen very high. But really, I mean, does that itself not cause racism? It's like I see a black guy and I assume that he's dumb because he's at university.
And it's clearly racist, because what about the very poor, disadvantaged whites from Appalachia and parts of West Virginia and Ohio and Kentucky? Look at the life of J.D. Vance, who's now, who is now, in the Ohio Senate. I mean, I encourage people to watch Hillbilly Elegy, which is actually a very, very good film. It's about his life growing up in the very, very the poorest parts of Ohio. I mean, it looks like, it's like if you've seen the mountain folk from Appalachia, that's what it looked like where he grew up, and with a mother who was addicted to drugs and just dirt poor poverty. This guy, through his own fortitude and grace and all of that, was able to make it into Yale. But are you saying that somehow he is less disadvantaged than an average, Hispanic or African American? How is this just not completely racist to people like him?
Well, okay, here's going back to some of the criticism of the Supreme Court from earlier, and just the runaway Supreme Court of the 20th century. Again, with some of these just awful Republican presidential nominees, particularly like Nixon, even Eisenhower put Warren on the court. You have it's just a policy of legislating from the bench, and that's what Bakke was. So you look at this decision, it's a Powell decision, plurality opinion, and he's saying that racial quotas offend the Constitution. They offend equal protection. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution stipulates that that the government has to grant equal protection of laws regardless of your race or the color of your skin. And so Powell says, okay, you can't have racial quotas. That offends the 14th Amendment. But then he's like, but you can take race into account and kind of give a little nudge to people. So it's like you can't offend the Constitution wholesale. You can't just attack it directly, but you can attack it piecemeal. You can attack it in smaller ways. You can go against the text of the Constitution in smaller ways. And again, what's important is that the court has come along and been like, no, the Constitution says that we are to be colorblind in our governmental policies, and that cannot be offended against. And we're getting rid of this old legislation from the bench technique where you essentially have opinions. Same with Grutter versus Bollinger, where you have Sandra Day O'Connor saying like, well, we can just phase out this affirmative action in 25 years. You know, it might not even be necessary. We expect that it won't be necessary, but for now, you know, as part of a holistic admissions process, these universities can indeed discriminate against whites and Asians. And like, it's just wrong. And what the court has done and what it's on the trajectory to keep doing is to repudiate this false, pernicious judicial philosophy that's been responsible for ushering in some of the worst policies of all time in American history.
Yeah, and it is really politicizing from the bench, which you're not supposed to do. The judicial branch is supposed to be apolitical. It doesn't take sides politically. It's not supposed to. That's the whole point of the judiciary branch, is to be apolitical. And the problem is, if you look at the dissents, Sotomayor, of course, Kagan, and Ketanji Jackson Brown, she recused herself from the Harvard case because she was on Harvard's governing body. She did not recuse herself from the North Carolina case. But here's the thing. They don't have a problem politicizing from the bench. They each have a philosophy of this entire country saturated with racism. All you have to do is look at what Sotomayor said. She says, quote, the court cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. That sounds very racist to me, that she's like, race has always mattered. But their philosophy is essentially, racism is everywhere. It's endemic to society, and therefore we need this. And I don't agree with her. I don't think racism is endemic. And there are a lot of black conservatives who also disagree. Clarence Thomas doesn't think racism is endemic.
He would be accused of being infiltrated with white supremacy as a black man.
Correct.
I think he has been accused of being infiltrated with white supremacy there.
Well, what's funny, you see in the decision, they're talking about, well, first of all, it's aside from the point, because these justices in the majority want to go from the text of black letter law, from the text of the Constitution, what's here, what's not. But they also note that, like, look, if you start looking at, as a policy matter, at kind of this grievance mongering and trying to bring people up based on perhaps past sins against them, trying to give them an edge in admissions, in hiring, and whatnot, then how far back do you go? And if you look at Ketanji Brown Jackson's, dissenting opinion, she actually says, like, you can't essentially make these decisions without studying history, and that there's always going to be these grievances that we essentially need government to help pull people out of. And it's like, well, fine. How come this goes only racially then? What about religious discrimination? What about the fact that Catholics, Irish Catholics, were discriminated against? What about Chinese Americans who were heavily discriminated against in the 19th century? These people, there are many groups, and it doesn't necessarily just break down along racial lines. It breaks down from national origin and religion as well. So how far down this rabbit hole?
Well, interestingly, so I mean, we could come and let's go back to what was your date, Christine? 78. Let's go back to 78. So since 78, universities have been discriminating against whites and Asians. Therefore, whites and Asians should, in fact, be given preferential admissions to universities. Well, I just think preferential admissions to universities. Let's just keep the pendulum swinging back and forth wildly, because apparently nobody is actually willing to do this. Let's just judge people by the content of their character or by their academic performance. I think there's an interesting thing here that I would want to say, and we've discussed on this table, I think a lot of the people on this panel, the whole question of, like, is university worth it? Is it worth going to college nowadays? And we came up with a number of answers and discussions. But related to that, going to university is not a right. It is not a right. These are private institutions who have the ability to choose who they will allow in. They do not have a limitless number of places available. As new universities open up, of course, there's ones there, and sometimes people open up these universities and you hear these horror stories. They're not accredited and they're some sort of scam and what have you, and people end up with these degrees that are worthless. People go to study subjects that are not, necessarily academically rigorous and they don't have any practical application. They come out with $100,000 in debt because they went to like some, fancy institution. But going to university is not a right. It is a privilege that should be based on your academic achievements and your ability to be intellectually elevated. And this notion of saying, well, I'm going to make it easier for you for whatever reason, because you're poor, because you are from a disadvantaged group, because whatever, that strikes right at the heart of what is being done within the notion of a meritocratic society. You need a meritocratic society because the alternative is planes start falling out of the sky.
Right. And as far as Ketanji Brown Jackson, we have to this is the same lady who could not define what a woman is. As soon as I saw that, it's just like, okay, if this person is appointed to this U.S. Supreme Court, is sort of lights out. How can you possibly take anyone seriously?
Well, she wasn't a biologist, remember?
Right, yes, yeah.
Wait, I'm not a biologist, but I know what a woman is.
Yeah.
What's
2 + 2? What is 2 + 2? I don't know. I'm not a mathematician. I can't answer that one.
You're not a mathematician? You are betraying your Asian people at that point.
With Ketanji Brown Jackson, though, the jokes actually write themselves here, because, who would have thunk it that Biden's affirmative action nominee to the Supreme Court, because he said,
that's
remember,
what she is.
She's
the token black woman on the Supreme Court.
Biden said it expressly. Yeah. He said,
so racist.
I'm going to choose somebody that is a black woman. He made a pledge that he was going to do this. So it's so shocking. I am shocked to know that she was for affirmative action. I wouldn't have seen that coming. And you know what? It's funny. She had to recuse herself from the Harvard side. But a lot of the Supreme Court's gone to Harvard. It's not just that she went to Harvard that I think it means that she had to recuse herself, because that would be like the whole Supreme Court.
She was on the Harvard governing board. That was the problem.
Okay.
She was like part of the whole admissions process.
I think maybe what lies beneath the surface also is that there could be a little bit of guilt, like, were you an affirmative action admission into Harvard, and therefore ruling on affirmative action at Harvard, that would be the conflict of interest? Because I think that's there, and somebody should call that out. But of course, we could have seen this coming. I knew where she was going to go with this the minute,
Oh, of course. Yeah. And just going back to Biden pronouncing, I'm sorry, the left is so racist. They claim they're not racist. They're completely racist. You've got Sotomayor, who's the token Hispanic woman on the court. Then you've got Elena Kagan.
Woman.
Yeah, exactly. You've got Elena Kagan, who's the token Jewish lesbian on the court. These people are so racist. They always look at the color of your skin to determine whether or not they should nominate you, appoint you, or whatever.
Anyway, I'm going to, because Kyle has sat here decently and quietly and so forth.
I'm fine with that. That's fine.
You with the affirmative action appointment on this day, because it's like, you're not the guy trying to, control the conversation and essentially behave like the audience and say, Dave, what do you mean by jurisprudence? This is a word with too many syllables, and explain it. But yeah, you were actually called it. But I believe you were going to talk about specifically what the church is teaching about work on a Sunday, because there's probably a lot of people out there, good Catholics watching our show, because that's how you become a good Catholic apparently, who may need to work on a Sunday, their employer may want them to work on a Sunday, and those sort of things. So can you expand on that a bit for us?
Sure, and this goes back to the Groff case, which was, I don't think we've said it during this show yet, but it was a unanimous decision. Every single Supreme Court justices were for this on this decision. So that's telling right there. And this is a win for not just Groff himself, but for people of all walks of life, of all faiths, for religious liberty, like we said, but particularly for those people. We call them Christians, right? Who hold Sunday as the Lord's day and who want to follow that third commandment, No, Protestants, it's not the fourth commandment. It is the third commandment that says keep holy the Lord's day. They want to follow that. And as Groff said, he's not really an outspoken guy. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. And so if you do find, the occasional clip of him, you can tell he's very humble. He's like, I'm just a small town guy who wants to serve God. And he wants to be able to practice his faith on Sunday and follow the commandment of not working. And I think many Christians out there, many Catholics in particular, are confused as to what not working on Sunday actually means. But the Catechism actually defines that. So the requirement is if you can get to Mass, if there's no mitigating circumstances, your car breaks down, you has to take care of a sick child, wherever you can't get to Mass, you got to get to Mass to fulfill your Sunday obligation there. But you also have to abstain from unnecessary servile work. So that is work, obviously, that you do with your body. It's not necessarily intellectual work, the work of the liberal arts. So you're supposed to do things on Sunday like read and perhaps write, spiritual journaling, reading good spiritual books, scripture, obviously, things like that. But you may be compelled, like you said, from an employer that you can't get out of the job situation and they might be forcing you to work on Sundays unnecessary servile work. Or you may be working in public service. You might be working in the medical field. You might be a policeman, something like that, where it is necessary for those types of things to be done on Sunday. Or even a Good Samaritan type of thing. You hear Jesus talking about the question is being asked of Jesus, well, if my my animal falls in the hole, can I get it out? Does that work? And if you find someone in need on Sunday, you can lift the car off them or something like that, whatever's going on in their situation, Superman style. So so it's a very strict definition of what servile. Yeah,
because of course Jesus was a few times when the Pharisees actually kind of tried to get Jesus on that issue of like he'd done work on the Sabbath, and of course there was sometimes it's like he's doing a straight up miracle. He's like healing somebody with divine power, and it's like you violating the work thing. And I'm like, did you not see him just cure this guy's leprosy like that? Did you not see that? Yeah. Did you read that? But of course there was the other one, which is kind of the ridiculous thing, where the Jesus and some of his apostles are crossing a field and they glean, this is where we get the phrase from, they glean the leftover kernels from the thing, which you were allowed to do at the time. You were allowed to glean what was left after the harvest to eat. And it was said, well, that counts as work on a Sunday. And it's like, okay, I mean, at that point, it's become a little ridiculous there. But certainly, I think we should be saying that obviously people should be treating Sunday as a day of rest, as a day of recreation. I think when you actually look at the formulation of the word recreation, recreation, it's this notion of, well, let's take a rest, let's rebuild ourselves, let's repair ourselves after all of the travails of the week, because obviously it's been difficult and it's been hard. We get to go to Mass, we have our spiritual food there in the Eucharist. We hear the homily, we are there with other Catholics and so forth. I think it is very important that Catholics should do that and not just treat Sunday as a day like that.
I agree, and I remember when I was living in France about 15 years ago, I spent a year living there, and obviously I was there when I was a little child, but I came back. And I was actually really struck, I've mentioned this many times before, France has a very deeply Catholic history and tradition, and some of those traditions continue on. For instance, I'd say most businesses close on Sunday, which was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that in my life. Because as you know, in America, everything's open 24/7 all the time. Doesn't matter what day. Every single day is the same as every other day. But in France, it was just completely different. And I actually had to make sort of a lifestyle change because now I had to buy groceries on Saturday. I couldn't go Sunday anymore if I needed something. And so I had to prepare in advance. But I thought, and everything was very quiet on a Sunday. People they rested, they relaxed, things like that. A lot of people went to church, many don't, but the point is, I thought, wow, this is completely different, and I really wish they did treat Sunday differently over there because of the Catholic tradition. I really wish America would do that more. And even today, there are some Christian-owned businesses that continue to, like, for instance, Hobby Lobby will not open on a Sunday.
Chick-fil-A, I think.
Chick-fil-A,
don't do that. I think what there is, and I was thinking about this when we were discussing the Groff case with regard to Amazon. So, and I was kind of jokingly saying, look, I don't get my mail on a Sunday, but if I order something on Amazon, chap turns up and he delivers it on a Sunday. And I was thinking about it, it's like, I do not need that. I do not need this delivered on a Sunday, like right now. I don't need that. I should adjust my life to do that. When I was living in the UK, a lot of the places in the UK will shut on a Sunday, or they have. When I was living there, I think it's changed now, but there was actually like a requirement that if you were open on a Sunday, it was truncated hours. I know that before I became Catholic, I had a job in a retail store, and I would always choose to work the Sunday because you got paid 8 hours for 6 hours of work, and so it was a great, wonderful thing. But that we as Christians should be looking to this notion of saying, okay, really? Okay, so Amazon, it comes along and says, hey, when do you want this delivered? Quick as possible. Okay, that means some poor schmuck is going to have to deliver this on a Sunday, which means, what's happening to him there? Could I say, hey, you know what, Monday will be fine, mate, I'm good. Can we be thinking, maybe I shouldn't be going to the grocery store on a Sunday, even if I can I be going on a Saturday? It's open there. I live next to a city which is, I don't know if it's predominantly Jewish, but there's a very large Jewish population. And so when I go to the grocery store on a Friday evening after work, obviously grocery stores on Friday evenings are always very full because people get paid on a Friday, they go grocery shopping. But in the city where I go to the grocery store, it is full of Jewish people, tell they're Jewish because they're Orthodox and they're dressing in a particular way, doing their shopping before their Sabbath, before the Saturday. And it's like, okay, so you're making that decision. All the grocery stores are open on a Saturday. You could go shopping on a Saturday, but you choose not to because you're practicing your religion and you're doing that there. I think, we as Christians, we should be more mindful of what choices we're making in that sense.
We're up in the godless north, and actually, if you look down south, there are states that still have blue laws on the books. Some states that still make it illegal to hunt on a Sunday, for example. And this is something that's prevalent. And by the way, so next time some liberal, some godless chap comes and is like, the United States was never a Christian nation, it's like, tell that to the states who made it illegal to do certain activities on a Sunday so that you can rest and contemplate the Lord. But we do that, and it's a salutary thing that should be really, exported to other states in the Union.
Yeah, and as far as the Amazon thing, just that in ordering something, expecting the next day, or maybe sometimes even that day itself, it feeds into this entire culture of just instant gratification, which we have become. We have become that. It's just, I want it now, immediately, I want it tomorrow. And, it's a good thing to wait, all right? Self-denial is a good thing. It's good to wait for things. And we need to just kind of recapture that kind of self-denial. Let's wait. We don't need it right now.
Only in America could we come up with a convenience store called 7-Eleven, right? Anytime, Christmas, wherever, any day, any hour of the day.
Any hour of the day. I remember, of course, in the UK, we have what we refer to as corner shops because they were always, often on the corner of streets. And they were owned by immigrants from Pakistan or India and that kind of place, because a lot of these guys came over as part of the Windrush generation shortly after the war. And I remember that my father used to love the fact that there was the convenience store there because there was a great guy, he was a Pakistani guy, he's probably dead now, God rest his soul. But he was Muslim. And he was Muslim, and so he was open on Christmas Day. And so when you forgot the one thing you needed for Christmas dinner, you could send me down to the grocery store, and he would be there, down to the corner shop, and you could get that there.
His loss is our gain.
His loss is our gain. But obviously, he was closed on his days, his holidays, and there was always a little sign up saying closed for this day. And obviously, we were like, okay, well, this is a wonderful thing. So I just do want to finish up by saying, obviously, we've been talking about these three rulings, and there have actually been other rulings that have come down recently, not necessarily directly related to kind of Catholic religious things, but they have been issues of, I hate this term of conservative, they've been authentically constitutional. I loved your phrase of the black letter of the law, Dave. I think that was very good. That these have been kind of authentic rulings that have been grounded in the Constitution. I think we do need to say that, look, obviously Donald Trump, because justices died and resigned, Donald Trump was able to put up 3 appointments, and because of machinations by Mitch the Turtle McConnell, they were able to get passed through the Senate. So obviously he got 3 Supreme Court appointments, but you were talking about Eisenhower and Nixon, who kind of did this lousy job in choosing these people. Trump did a good choice. I mean, a lot of things, I've said a lot of things about Donald Trump that he's bit of a liability, not necessarily as half as good as we think he is. But in terms of these appointments, and I think as well appointments elsewhere on the federal bench, he actually did some real good. So we do need to give Donald Trump props for that.
And the geriatric mutant ninja turtle.
And the geriatric mutant ninja turtle, Mitch McConnell. Every time I mention Mitch McConnell, I have to mention that he looks like a turtle, because he does. Look, terrible, terrible, terrible senator. Just rhino, not good, terrible. But in terms of just like knowing parliamentary procedure and being able to get stuff through with like a wild and fractious caucus, Mitch McConnell every day and twice on Sundays. All right, anyway, thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Now, please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. Ad te clamamus exules filii Eve. Ad te suspiramus gementes efflentes. In hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos, ad nos convete. Et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you again for joining us for The Download. We premiere a new episode like this every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Except tomorrow, because tomorrow, of course, is the 4th of July, and we will be taking the day off to celebrate the country's founding, and we hope that you too will be doing that as well. I hope that your employer is not mandating you work on the 4th of July, and if you are taking the day off, please don't go shopping on that day. Make it clear to all of the store owners that, you know what, it's not worth opening on the 4th. Give their people the day off. Anyway, from all of us here at Church Militant, may God bless you.